This lecture is an introductory lecture to the 2019-2020 arms sales debate topic. The resolution is resolved. The United States federal government should substantially reduce direct commercial sales and/or foreign military sales of arms from the United States. In this lecture, I'll cover a discussion of the terms of the resolution and the important background, that you will need to debate the topic. Let's start by looking at three simple terms. First is the federal government. The federal government simply refers to the central government in Washington, D.C. It's no different than what you've debated under any other resolution. Should involves really just means ought. Should we reduce sales? So the topic, as of every other policy debate topic, is not will sales be reduced, but should we reduce them? Third, I want to just briefly define the term arms sales, even though it doesn't directly appear in the resolution. The resolution talks about direct commercial sales, foreign military sales of arms. I'll talk about that. But we are kind of fundamentally getting at the question of arms sales. And arms sales, you can find other definition, but basically arms sales refer to any type of weapon system or ammunition that's sold, and including the electronics and radar and guidance systems that support warfare. So arms sales itself is a very, very broad concept. It covers basically any types of weapons or weapon support system that's sold abroad. The next terms I'm going to talk about are a little bit more difficult to define, at least in terms of how we want to define them for the purpose of debate. Reduce. Reduce means, what does it mean, right? Reduce, you can generally say, well, if I'm going 100 miles an hour and I slow down and I go 55 miles an hour, I've reduced my speed. That's very intuitive. It's counterintuitive, however, to say, well, I'm going to reduce my speed because I normally go, I was going to drive 100 miles an hour, but now I'm just going to drive 75 miles an hour, so I've reduced my speed. So when the police pull me over and they say, sir, you really need to slow down, if I say, well, I did slow down, I was thinking about driving 100 miles an hour, and now I'm only driving 75, they'll look at me like, there's something wrong with me. And the least of my problems will, be getting a ticket. So reducing from a hypothetical future does not seem like a reduction. Now, that is kind of a little bit problematic in this topic, because what a reduction in arms sales about conceptually in the literature is generally talking about reducing arms sales that have not yet occurred, right? Obviously aren't going to go to a country and take their weapons back. They're not really going to go for that. But it's talking about kind of a reduction. Now, it doesn't have to be. There are current contracts, all right, that the U.S. has with other countries, U.S. government and companies have with other countries that could theoretically be broken. Say, well, we have a contract with Saudi Arabia to sell weapons to them, but we're not going to. The second thing is what's the difference? There are two different types of future sales. One is we can say, look, in the future we're likely to sell arms, continue to sell arms to Saudi Arabia. We're not going to do that anymore, right? That's kind of the equivalent to I was likely going to go 100 miles an hour, but I'm only going 75, right? So what's likely can we reduce from that? But then there's the things of what sales have been approved but not executed. So maybe a company has submitted to the U.S. government for approval of a sale, and if the U.S. government does not approve that sale, then is that a reduction, right? It's a little more specific. It's not just this hypothetical, we're probably going to sell arms to Saudi Arabia in the future. It's saying we're likely to sell arms to Saudi Arabia in the future, and because the sale has been proposed, and we're not going to do it. So they're both hypothetical future increases. One is a little more concrete than the other because there's a proposed sale that could be blocked. And as again kind of just mentioned, kind of the card at the bottom of this slide kind of brings up the question, well, when we're looking at the sales, the total number of sales, people are already kind of adding up intended purchases to foreign, right, by foreign nations, right? That these are what they intend to purchase. And people arguing for a reduction in sales in the literature kind of intuitively arguing that these kind of pending purchases should not be approved, and maybe that even purchases beyond those should not be approved. But it does kind of get into a question of what is a literal reduction. The other question related to reduce is, what about processes? So a lot of people who are calling for kind of less arms sales want to make it more difficult to sell weapons. Like they may say, for example, we shouldn't sell arms sales to human rights abusers, so we're going to make the president certify that a particular country is not a human rights abuser. We're going to make it more difficult to sell things, so everything even under $14 million, and I'll talk about that later, has to be approved by the State Department. We're going to make it easier for the House of Representatives to issue a resolution of disapproval and then make the president comply with that. Now, in none of those instances do we know that the arms sales are actually going to decline, right? Trump's probably not going to say somebody's a human rights, abuser and then to block the sale. If he wants the sale to go through, he'll just say, hey, they're not really that bad. They're not a human rights abuser. We don't know the House of Representatives is going to issue a disapproval resolution. We don't know that if you make it easier to sell weapons without U.S. government approval for a value of less than $14 million, the fewer weapons will be sold, right? We don't know this, so it's not what you call in debate an on-face reduction. So there's a bunch of different ways that plans may not actually arguably be reductions. So you can think about it this way. Just kind of think about these plans. This is something you could discuss with your group. Are the following plans topical? 1, Congress. What if you say Congress blocks proposed sale to Saudi Arabia? Congress, there's a sale coming through. Congress would have to approve. They're actually going to block it. Is that a topical action? If you say, well, Congress won't approve any future sales to Saudi Arabia, is that a topical action? Is that an actual reduction? If the U.S. were to announce we're not going to sell any more weapons at all to Saudi Arabia in the future, is that a reduction? Is it a reduction to break an existing contract with Saudi Arabia to supply them arms or to supply them spare parts? What about these review processes for sales? Weapons must not be defensive. I think if you went with the literal definition of reduction, the only thing that would probably be topical is number 4, to break existing contracts with Saudi Arabia. Though, like I say, there is some advocacy for that, which will be a negative argument. But again, it is not as much of what's kind of being talked about in the literature. We're probably talking about more actions under number 1 and number 2. Now, you might say, well, how many cases are number 1 and number 2? Well, a lot. Okay, substantially reduced. If you go to this website with the URL, and you can look at the URL there, or download a copy of the actual PowerPoint from the Debate Us website, this shows that all the different sales that have been proposed or approved, mostly approved sales, right? So there's all these individual sales that have been approved, but the weapons haven't yet been delivered, okay? So the question then becomes, like, if these weapons haven't yet been delivered, then we could say those sales are not going to go through. So a topical interpretation of reduce could be, hey, there are a whole bunch of sales out there that have basically been approved, but the weapons haven't been sent yet. Okay, so we're not going to send those weapons. That's what a reduction means. It means from going from an approved sale to that sale now becoming unimproved. So cases that talk about, we're not going to sell them this weapon system that people are just talking about probably selling them, but it hasn't been approved yet, that is not an actual reduction in sales. Now, that's a reasonable argument. Now, of course, the negative, once you open that, if that becomes your interpretation of what reduce means, that obviously could put you in a little bit of tension with the word substantial, right? A lot of teams are going to want to say that these individual weapons sales, these contracts, which are usually small, right? If we allow the affirmative to make cases out of all these individual contracts and kind of have the U.S. government essentially reverse itself on these contracts, then what's going to happen is that there aren't going to be as many, there are going to be like lots of cases, right? You can see this is like updated through May 9th, but it's already May 22nd. And I actually looked this morning, I just didn't change the slide. There have been a whole bunch of additional approved sales, right? So you'd be talking about tons of different sales. And as this next slide shows, we have supply arms to at least 98 nations. Now, all of these are arguably not sales, and I'll talk about that in a little bit in the future. But these all are, a lot of these are sales, or at least a lot of these include sales. So you're looking at like 98 different countries, lots of different weapon systems being sold. Even go back to that general discussion of what an arms sales were. Arms sales is it's all different kinds of things. So if you set your interpretation of reduce to say you can reduce, you can't kind of generally reduce against the future. You have to block like kind of one of the existing transfers that has been approved. That interpretation really turns the topic into a debate about small, like tons of different weapon systems, which will be an affirmative argument. Probably they'll come back and say we don't want a topic that looks like that, because then the word substantially maybe kind of becomes meaningless, right? Your interpretation of reduce, the affirmative will say, renders substantially meaningless in the topic because these are trivial decreases. You see the numbers of sales, hundreds of billion, $100+ billion a year, okay? And you're only talking about now blocking like individual weapon systems, right? So, you could debate this out. The purpose of this is not do a separate lecture on topicality, but this kind of gets you thinking about what you want to talk about. Now, direct commercial sales. The resolution refers to both direct commercial sales and foreign military sales. I actually don't think this is going to come up a lot in your debates. It might come up in terms of maybe like a process counterplan that people could run about which type of sales are like you're reducing or not decreasing. That, you could change the process that you would change for one might be different than another. I'm not sure how this will all play out in the debate. My guess is it's not going to play out a lot. But I do want you to understand what these terms mean since they're in the resolution. A direct commercial sale is something that's directly negotiated, okay, between a company, all right, and another government, right, or another company. So it's not, the U.S. does not get involved in the negotiation of a direct commercial sales contract. Foreign military, or really kind of fulfill the contract or be responsible for the contract in any way. They just approve it, as I'll talk about in a second. Foreign military sales, however, are part of the U.S. Security Assistance Program, okay, where we sell articles of defense to other foreign countries and international organizations. And I highlight international organizations there because international organizations, it's usually governments that we're selling weapons to, but sometimes we sell weapons to an organization. So we have sold weapons to the Syrian, there's a rebel group in Syria that's trying to overthrow the Syrian government. We've also given away a lot of weapons, but we have sold them weapons, so that's an arms sale. But these are coming from the U.S. government. All right, foreign military sales programs are conducted through binding contractual agreements between U.S. government and authorized foreign purchases. So you can see on this next chart what the basic difference is, right? Foreign military sales, the U.S. DoD, that's the Department of Defense, will negotiate with the customer on behalf of the vendor being the company that sells the weapons. The U.S. DoD assumes the contracting risk and guarantees the payment to the customer. The defense industry, it's a good business to get into in some ways, right? Like, the U.S. government negotiates your contract, they guarantee payment for it. It's a government-to-government transfer, and they're responsible for, the U.S. government's responsible, meaning the executive branch in this instance, is responsible for notifying the Congress. In a direct commercial sale, the customer negotiates directly with the vendor, right? So the Saudi Arabian government negotiates directly with the U.S. defense company. The U.S. defense government is not involved in the transaction. They don't act on behalf of the customer or the vendor. If there are any complications, we do have to, the vendor, the company selling the weapons has to get approval from the U.S. government, which makes sense because, otherwise you'd have companies selling weapons to Iran and North Korea and Russia, like our obvious enemies, okay? And then there's a notification made. So the U.S. government kind of gets involved in the approval of the transaction, but is not directly involved in executing and supporting the sale. So, there's some differences there. Now, in terms of the balance of the two, most of the sales, or you can see the larger portion, is under direct commercial sales. Foreign military sales rose 33% to $55.6 billion in 2017. Direct commercial sales are up to $136.6 billion in 2017. So again, I don't really know that this distinction is going to get debated very much, but it is very important to understand what's in these two categories of sales. Now, these kind of are generally not considered to be military aid, right? A sale. If I sell you something, you're buying it. All right? So this says that this study, at least, that was done, this one study says term military aid does not consider military arms sales. Now, that is just for the purpose of this study, right? That's it. Like, if you do a study, you define terms for your study. That doesn't mean this is an official U.S. government definition or anything like that. So this kind of is obviously something that needs to be looked into more, right? But the argument is that we just give weapons away. Those are not actually constituting of sales. In addition to being from the study, is also like a little bit intuitive, okay? And this one further clarifies it, all right? Where if if the selling nation is bearing all or most of the cost, that's not considered an arms sale. Now, it can get a little bit more complicated, right? Like, the U.S. gives for what's called foreign military financing to countries and say, okay, here's some money, like, to buy weapons. It could just be money to buy weapons. Those countries then buy the weapons from the U.S. companies. That's a sale, right? It's a foreign military sale. The U.S. is getting involved in it. We're supplying the financing. So that's one way. That's potentially a sale, even though it's military aid. Second, might just kind of generally extend financing and say, okay, here are the terms under which you have to pay it back. That might constitute military aid. We're making it possible for another country to buy weapons, right? But they're also buying them, right? So it's kind of setting it up. This happens a lot in the case of Israel. Most of the weapons Israel has to buy under U.S. aid that it gets come from the United States. So I don't think this is as clear a distinction as this evidence that I actually found in another file seems to try to want to indicate. But it seems that we can give military aid, and that can kind of include and its receipt be conditioned on buying arms sales from the United States. But it doesn't seem that they are also doesn't seem the case that they are exactly the same thing. Now, the resolution does say of arms, and like I said, I talked about that earlier, it's tanks, missiles, but is it kind of like spare parts, software, maintenance? Usually when an arms, say just take a fighter jet, is sold to another country, fighter jet is a pretty complex system, right? That includes obviously all the hardware, right? The plane, the wings, the tires, the steels, all those kind of things. Then it includes the software that makes the plane run. And as we saw in these recent crashes of these Boeing jets, the software has the lighter control over the airplane. These software systems are not simply replaceable. So it's not like maybe in the old days you could buy a country a plane and they could fly it, and if it needed a new tire, they could get the tire from somebody else. They can't just get the software system from somewhere else, right? The defense companies have proprietary control over these software systems. They protect it. They protect it for a security system. You can't just go get a Russian software system and supply a U.S. plane any easier than you could go put an app that's designed, for a Microsoft computer, on an Apple computer, or vice versa, right? These are kind of controlled proprietary systems. And so when U.S. companies sell arms, they usually don't just sell the plane. They also sell maintenance contracts, software updates. The munitions too also usually you can't just put in different bombs on the planes. They have to go with the planes, and they're part of the software system. So as this kind of piece of evidence seems to suggest, that the associated equipment, training, and logistical support are also part of the arms sale, right? And if you could even see of arms, U.S. arms sales notifications by weapon category, military equipment and training also seems to fall under arms sales, right? So that's just important to know, because some people do advocate just stopping this category, military support, in training and military equipment and training, and saying, look, if we don't provide military equipment and training, Saudi Arabia won't be able to use its planes anymore and fly and drop bombs in Yemen. Yeah, we can't take the planes back, okay? But if we don't kind of provide this, we break these maintenance and support contracts, then they're going to have to stop the war in Yemen. Right? And that also then kind of gets at a question of what reduce means, right? It's that's something the affirmative could break. They could break a maintenance contract, which, would reduce arms sales as long as those individual parts are arms. Because again, we're not taking the plane back, but when we take the maintenance and support back, we block it off, we make our engineers come home, they're not going to be able to fly those planes anymore. So that's very important. Now, let's look at so that defines some key terms in the resolution. What's the status quo? The status quo generally is toward increased arms exports. Globally, arms exports are increasing. Okay, you could see there's a 44% increase in arms sales between 2002 and 2007. The United States is the biggest arms exporter. Okay, our exports from foreign governments to just the foreign governments, right, which is most of the sales, increased by 33%. And you can see that over there, we signed off on exports worth over $192 billion over the past year, a 13% increase. What does sign off mean? That's interesting, right? Because that gets at the question, okay, of what are you reducing from? We didn't agree to $192 billion worth of contracts. Okay, not even anywhere close to that, right? Okay, so when you look at what does substantially mean, reduce versus what? Okay, you say, well, that's a trivial, sure, the affirmative is a trivial decrease relative to like what was signed off on, but not what relative was like actually approved. Okay, that can be like a big difference, right? And then of course that gets into the topicality debate. But generally speaking, global sales are increasing, U.S. exports are increasing. Part of this, when we'll talk about this a little bit more in a minute, but part of this is enabled by a new U.S. conventional arms transfer policy developed under the Trump administration to support the transfer of weapons. In the case of who controls these weapons, you can see the U.S. or controls these exports. You can see the United States is the dominant global supplier, followed by Russia, whose sales percentage-wise are actually declining a little bit, France, Germany, and China. And then you can see this kind of represented in terms of total value of exports, right? Billions of dollars with exports in a given year. You can see the United States most, Russia second, Germany, France, the UK, the same countries we had kind of lined up there before. We see kind of China in there. But, the U.S. is kind of the dominant global supplier, followed by Russia, which is actually substantial. Who are we selling these weapons to? Saudi Arabia, right, our number one kind of recipient. Then Australia, the United Kingdom, Israel, Iraq, the United Arab Emirates, Qatar. All right, Republic of China, that's Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, Italy. All right, all the way down, you can flip through these kind of on your own. And you go down, I like the second last one is the Syrian rebels, which I mentioned earlier. They're the only country on this list, or I would say the only entity on this list that is not a country. We sold them basically $1 million worth of sales. But all these are potential case areas. I don't really know that there's one thing, even though conceptually the topic is very large, it is hard to find evidence arguing that the U.S. should reduce particular sales. Yes, there are people who generally kind of complain about U.S. arms sales, and I think that evidence will be useful for a lot of critique-oriented cases. But when kind of the pedal hits the metal, so to speak, there aren't a lot of advocates for reducing particular sales. There's probably enough to make a debate topic out of it, but it's not like there are really probably hundreds of cases. But these kind of countries, figuring out what weapons the U.S. sells to these countries and finding pieces of evidence that says that we need to reduce these sales, that reducing these sales would solve some particular problem, is where all your case ground is going to come from. Generally, you can see who's importing. Okay, again, like Saudi Arabia, Egypt, all right, Australia, India, those are big importers. It's kind of interesting because we know Saudi Arabia is buying a lot from the United States. We know that Australia is. I'm not sure about Egypt. India buys a lot of weapons, but their biggest supplier is Russia. So this kind of import, which countries import, does not mean that they're importing from the United States. It just means they're importing. There's a good chance they are because the U.S. is the largest exporter. All right, but we've also seen that there are other countries importers as well. Now to go back kind of to the U.S. Trump's policy and how the U.S. is increasing arms exports. Trump is a big fan of arms sales. Okay, he wants to do a few things under this new arms transfer policy. First of all, he wants to sell more weapons and more types of weapons. All right, without necessarily getting to U.S. allies, without necessarily having to get approval of the U.S. government all the time. He thinks this will increase jobs in the United States and enable the U.S. to kind of become a dominant player in global arms sales. Specifically, one of the things he wants to do is sell more drones. The U.S. has always limited the amount of drones that's sold abroad, and it still does kind of to a substantial degree because we don't want other countries to gain access to our drone technology. Now, the problem with this is that other countries, especially China, are now starting to step up and sell drones. So if the U.S. is not selling the drones anymore, then other countries are going to come in and sell them. So Trump wants to, which is a great, it's a good negative argument, right? If we don't sell them, China will, that's worse, blah, blah, blah. But the point is that Trump is kind of trying to relax the restrictions on these drone sales. So I think this will become a lucrative affirmative case, a strong affirmative case, as long as you can win in that actual reduction. Trump also wants to kind of have counter-terror assistance. The part of the reason he's selling arms is to get other countries to engage in counter-terror cooperation with us. Now, you can say that that's a bad idea. Counter-terror cooperation is bad. Using arms sales in that way is bad, but it's also obviously a strong kind of negative argument. Again, Russia. Trump, one thing that just came out just before I recorded this lecture, I got a little bit lucky, is the U.S. is reinstituting a program it had during the Cold War, that height of hostilities between the U.S. and Russia, to allow countries, or to encourage countries to buy U.S. weapons, but kind of tying U.S. aid, particularly military aid, and I talked about that a little bit earlier. In order to get that aid from the United States, and to get more aid, you have to buy U.S. weapons, and you even have to replace your older Russian weapons. Now, I don't know if there's really a case to say, like, cutting back this program will reduce sales, because we don't know that it would. They may still kind of buy or not buy the weapons from the U.S. in the same quantities, independent of whether or not this program exists. So again, it's not a quote-unquote on-face reduction. But it's still arguably, it's probably not a case area, but you should definitely useful in a couple ways. One, just kind of researching around this question will expose you to different arguments and ideas that are important to the topic. The second thing is that there's this negative argument that I think is pretty good that says, hey, if we don't sell the weapons, then Russia to countries, they'll go buy the weapons from Russia. And that'll strengthen Russia's defense industrial base and also increase their alliance relationships with those countries, kind of at the expense of U.S. alliance relationships. Well, this kind of reinforces the uniqueness to that argument that, look, U.S. sales are increasing, Russian sales are decreasing. We're pulling countries away from Russia by getting them to buy more weapons from the United States instead of Russia, and that could become reversed. So that just kind of at the end there contextualizes the uniqueness. So this part of the lecture was just kind of meant to give you kind of a general introduction to the topic, to start thinking about what some of the words mean, all right, and how that could play out in terms of what types of plans are topical, like how can sales be reduced topically? And I gave you those questions to think about earlier. Right, and then contextualizing that in terms of what's actually being sold, some different small weapon systems, all the different countries that the U.S. is selling to, and kind of thinking about the fact that the status quo is kind of heading in the direction of increasing sales, right, which is kind of good for a debate topic, right, because that means there's potentially more cases for the affirmative, right, to potentially more areas they can find where we're going to decrease it. It also gives the negative some good uniqueness arguments, because you can say that those reductions in sales are actually, any disadvantages, I should say, to reducing sales are actually unique. Okay, so in the next lecture, we'll actually get into the discussion of the cases.